On your way in this evening, you will almost certainly have passed someone who is homeless. And sadly, on your way home this evening, you'll probably do the same. So tell me, when you see a homeless person, who here thinks that they know how to feel about that and what to do about it? It's incredibly tough, isn't it? It's incredibly tough to reach across this huge social gulf that divides some of us from people who are homeless. The last time that I had a proper conversation with someone who was homeless, was at a project that my organisation funds. Part of what we do is that we fund charities that help homeless people. And I was standing in a room much like this, not quite so grand, but about the same size. And into the room came a woman called Jill. And I kind of spotted her straight away, very, very thin, old before her time. And she walked along the edge of the room quite quickly and found the most inconspicuous corner to stand in. And there was a big part of me that wanted to go over and talk to Jill. But there was also a part of me that really didn't, that felt intimidated by the idea of talking to somebody so different from myself. And anyway, I plucked up courage and I went and had this conversation with Jill, and she told me something about her life. And she said that she had become homeless in recent years because she had been in and out of prison. And she had been in trouble with the law, largely because she had a big drug problem. I subsequently found out that she was the most notorious drug user in her local area. Yikes. Now, the reason why she had started taking drugs is that Jill was trying to mask quite a serious mental health problem that she has. And where did this mental health problem come from? It came from her experiences of severe abuse as a child. This kind of domino effect through her life. And as she was telling me this story, and I could tell that she told this story a lot to people like me before, but as she was telling it, I felt overwhelmed. I just thought, well, how do you respond to something so alien from your own experience? What can I do about it? What can a white middle-class male do about something that I have never experienced? And I have to say, I was really glad that also in the room at this project was a number of Jill's support workers, because Jill has a lot of support workers. There was her mental health worker, her homelessness worker, her drug worker. And anyway, the day got going, and it was like a participation event. It was designed to be creative and get people involved and interacting and building friendships. And about halfway through the day, I noticed that Jill had gravitated to another corner of the room where this piano stood. And then to my amazement, she lifted the lid of this piano and sat down, and she started to play. Now, I cannot tell you what an unlikely event this was if you had met Jill. It was extraordinary. And there was consternation in the room, and everyone stood in silence and just listened to Jill play. And the piano was terrible, but she was really very good. She got to the end, and once the applause and the whooping had died down, one of her support workers went over to her and said, "Jill, I didn't know you could play the piano." And she said, I used to be a piano teacher. And here's the thing, not a single one of her support workers knew this about her. They knew everything there was to know about her homelessness problem, her drug problem, her mental health problem. They got all of that taped, but they didn't know who she was. They didn't know that she was a piano teacher. And I was thinking about this on the train on the way back, and it reminded me of this very famous study that was conducted by the Tavistock Institute here in London. And it was a study of nursing on a ward. And what they had noticed about nurses is that they had started specializing in different tasks. So one set of nurses would do the bedding, and then another set of nurses would deal with the meds, and then another set would do the hygiene, the personal hygiene. And what the researcher noticed was that none of the nurses was there for the whole patient. And indeed, when the nurses talked about patients in the staff room, they often referred to them in terms of their condition or their illness. They didn't even use their names. And what the researcher concluded was that the nurses were experiencing huge anxiety in the face of the enormity of what some of these patients were going through, their conditions, their illnesses. And in order to defend themselves from this anxiety, they had broken the patients down into tasks. They weren't seeing the whole patient themselves. And I realized, well, this is partly what's going on with Jill's workers. You know, they have broken Jill down into her constituent parts, her problems, but they're not seeing who Jill is. And I liken this to dealing with something as overwhelming, let's say, as an elephant, where in order to deal with the enormity of the elephant, you chop it into pieces. Because in doing so, what you don't end up with is lots of small, manageable elephants. You end up with chunks of dead elephants on the ground, because those parts of the elephant are interdependent. They only make sense in terms of the whole elephant. But this is what we do with human beings who need our support. We break them down into manageable chunks that we can deal with. But there's another aspect of this story, which is that Jill herself did not want to be seen. She walked along the edge of the room to the inconspicuous part. When she told me her story, she told me her official story about her problems, the one that she thought I wanted to hear. She didn't tell me who she was. And recently I've been thinking about Jill and realizing, that desire not to be seen is actually something that I can relate to. When I was at school, from about 12 to 16, I tried to disappear. I tried to be invisible. I was bullied every day because of my sexuality, and I dealt with that by trying to disappear, to be this kind of shadow figure that nobody could point at, nobody could single out. I tried to sort of void myself. And I managed to do that for 4 years. I managed to be a non-person for 4 whole years. And I'd kind of forgotten that. I'd kind of forgotten that I'd done it until I was thinking about Jill. And here's the thing, Jill stepped forward and she allowed herself to be seen. She allowed herself to be seen as a piano teacher. And the same kind of thing happened to me. We went on a residential, my class, it was A-level English literature, and we were studying Hamlet. And we went on this residential to enact Hamlet, to learn about it as a play. And it was incredibly creative and participative and engrossing. And I forgot to hide for that moment. For that weekend, I became Hamlet. And I allowed myself to step forward and be seen in the same way that Jill allowed herself to step forward and be seen as this piano teacher. And so one obvious conclusion from this is that homeless people, just like all of us actually, need these kind of spaces where we can step beyond the identities that we have been given, that sometimes we are punished for, that allow ourselves to express who we actually are, beyond the labels. But there is another conclusion that I'm drawing from this, which is that if we are going to reach across this big social gulf that divides some of us from homeless people, maybe we need to locate that part of ourselves that feels homeless. And if we are going to see homeless people for who they actually are, maybe we need to acknowledge that there's part of ourselves that doesn't want to be seen. Because when we see a homeless person and think, you know, I don't get that life, I don't know how to relate, there's nothing that I can do about that, maybe that's because we have seen something in that person that we don't want to see in ourselves. Thank you.